Story number 1.
It started as a trip like any other. Every year, my cousin Dale and I would take a fishing trip to some quiet spot in the woods, away from the stress of our daily lives. We'd pack our rods, a cooler full of beer, and enough supplies to last a few days. This time, Dale had found a new spot, Lake Wendigo. I should have known better the moment he said the name. I laughed when he told me, joking about the old legends. Everyone around these parts had heard of the Wendigo, an emaciated, flesh-hungry creature from Native American folklore, something that belonged in scary stories told around the campfire. But Dale waved me off. It's just a name, man, he said. No one comes out here anymore, and the fish are supposed to be huge. That part got my attention. A place untouched by tourists, full of fish. It sounded perfect, so I ignored the gnawing feeling in my gut and agreed to go. We left early on a Friday morning, driving hours into the wilderness. The paved roads gave way to gravel, then dirt, until finally we reached a narrow, overgrown trail leading deeper into the woods. Dale pulled over. "We hike from here." I looked around. "How far?" "About a mile." We grabbed our packs and rods and set off. The deeper we went, the quieter everything became. I hadn't realized how much I'd come to expect the background hum of birds and insects until it was gone. The trees here were massive, their trunks thick and gnarled, their branches tangled in a way that blocked out most of the sunlight. Something felt wrong. I chalked it up to the eerie silence and kept walking. Finally, we reached the lake. It was beautiful, almost too beautiful. The water was still dark and glassy, reflecting the trees like a perfect mirror. No signs of life disturbed its surface, no fish jumping, no dragonflies skimming along the top. Dale didn't seem to care. "See? Told you this place was great." We set up camp near the shore and wasted no time casting our lines. The fish bit fast, almost too fast. Within an hour, we'd caught more than we'd normally get in a whole afternoon. Dale whooped with excitement, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The fish didn't struggle. Usually, when you hook a fish, they fight. They thrash, they pull, they try to get away. But these, they barely moved. It was like they were already dead. I mentioned it to Dale, but he just laughed. Less work for us. The sun set faster than I expected. One moment we had daylight. The next, shadows had swallowed the lake. It happened so quickly that it caught me off guard. Then came the smell. A thick, rancid stench like rotting meat mixed with something sour. It hit so suddenly that I gagged. "What the hell is that?" I coughed, covering my nose. Dale sniffed the air and shrugged. Maybe something died nearby? I looked around, but I didn't see anything. No animal carcasses, no sign of decay. Just the dark trees looming over us and the black water stretching into the distance. We sat by the fire, drinking beer and trying to shake the unease. Dale, as always, was the first to fall asleep, snoring loudly in his tent. I stayed up a little longer, staring into the flames. Then I heard it. A splash. It wasn't a small one, like a fish breaking the surface. It was heavy, as if something large had stepped into the water. I turned slowly, flashlight in hand, and scanned the shoreline. Nothing, just the still lake and the trees beyond it. Then another splash, closer this time. I gripped the flashlight tighter and took a step toward the water. The beam cut through the darkness, but there was nothing there. No ripples, no sign of movement. But the smell was stronger now. I backed away and climbed into my tent, zipping it up tight. It was a childish thing to do, but something about that place was getting to me. I kept the flashlight on, my hand resting on the handle of my knife, and listened. The night was dead silent. Then came the whispering. At first I thought it was the wind, but there was no wind. The whispers were low, just beyond my tent, shifting and slithering like multiple voices speaking at once. I held my breath. The voices grew clearer, though I couldn't understand the words. It sounded wrong, like something trying to mimic human speech, but failing. I wanted to call out to Dale, but I was afraid. Afraid that if I made a sound, whatever was out there would know I was awake. Then, just outside my tent, something exhaled. A deep, raspy breath, so close I could feel it through the thin fabric. I gripped my knife tighter, my fingers slick with sweat. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would burst out of my chest. Then, slowly, the breathing moved away. The whispering faded. I don't know how long I lay there, but at some point, exhaustion took over, and I passed out. When I woke up, the sun was rising. The fire had burned out, and the smell was gone. Dale was already up, stretching and yawning. "Damn, man, you look like hell." I didn't tell him what I'd heard. I just wanted to leave. But Dale had other plans. "One more day," he said. "Then we'll head back." I should have argued. I should have told him about the whispers, the breathing, the feeling that we weren't alone. But I didn't. I didn't want to sound crazy, so I stayed. That evening, as the sky turned red, I made up my mind to keep watch all night. No sleep, no mistakes. And then Dale screamed. I spun around, heart slamming into my ribs. He was at the water's edge, staring at something in the lake. His face was white as bone. I followed his gaze and felt my stomach drop. A figure stood in the water. At first, I thought it was a person. But then I saw its limbs, too long, too thin, ending in claw-like fingers. Its skin was stretched tight over sharp bones, its eyes hollow and black. It had no lips, just jagged teeth exposed in a permanent grin. It watched us, unmoving. Then, in a blink, it was closer. Dale stumbled back, nearly falling. "We're leaving," he gasped. We grabbed what we could and ran. We didn't bother packing, didn't even put out the fire. Branches tore at my arms as we sprinted through the trees. My legs burned, my lungs screamed, but I didn't stop. And behind us, something followed. Not running, not crashing through the brush, just the whispering. Slithering, coiling around us, growing louder with every step. Then, all at once, it stopped. We burst out onto the dirt road where the truck was parked. I turned, expecting to see it standing at the tree line, but there was nothing. Just the silent forest and the still lake beyond it. We didn't speak on the drive home. We never went back, and I never went fishing again. But sometimes, late at night, when everything is quiet, I still hear the whispers, and I know it's still watching. Story the end.
Story number 2.
Fishing has always been a passion of mine, a way to disconnect from the chaos of daily life and lose myself in the peacefulness of nature. For years, I've spent weekends and summer vacations fishing in various lakes and rivers, always seeking the thrill of a good catch and the tranquility that comes with it. But I never expected that one fishing trip would alter my perception of nature forever. The trip began like any other. I had planned to spend a few days at a remote lake, Blackwater Lake, tucked deep in the forests of northern Ontario. A friend of mine, Danny, had been raving about this lake for years. He had told me countless stories of the massive fish he'd caught, the solitude it provided, and the beauty of the surroundings. It was his go-to spot, a place he visited at least twice a year. So when he invited me to join him, I was eager for the opportunity. A few days in the wilderness, away from the distractions of life, sounded perfect. Danny had always been an experienced fisherman, the kind of guy who could read the water and know exactly where to cast his line. I trusted his judgment, and we were both looking forward to a quiet, relaxing trip. We rented a cabin on the lake, far enough from civilization that there would be no interruptions. The cabin was basic, with no electricity, but it was charming, with wooden walls and a stone fireplace. The perfect setup for a few days of fishing and unwinding. We arrived on a Thursday afternoon with the sun hanging low in the sky. The drive had been long. The last few miles were on a gravel road that wound through dense forest. By the time we reached the cabin, the air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. The lake stretched out in front of us, dark and still, surrounded by towering trees and rocky cliffs. It was beautiful, but there was something about it that felt a little off, as if the lake held a secret. Danny wasn't bothered by the lake's eerie calmness. He had been there many times before and was familiar with its quiet, isolated nature. We unpacked our gear and settled in. Danny immediately set up his fishing rod, eager to get started. We launched the small boat from the dock and pushed out into the middle of the lake. The water was as smooth as glass, reflecting the overcast sky above. There was no breeze, no sound, except for the faint splash of our paddles in the water. We spent the afternoon fishing near the shore, enjoying the serenity of the lake. Danny was the first to catch a fish, a large pike that put up a good fight. It was a thrill, and I felt my excitement grow as I imagined what else the lake could offer. We fished until the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a purple hue over the water. As the evening grew darker, we returned to the cabins, built a fire in the fireplace, and settled in for a quiet night. But as I sat there, sipping on a beer and listening to the crackle of the fire, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about the lake. It was so quiet, too quiet. There were no sounds of birds or animals, no rustling of leaves in the wind, just silence. I tried to dismiss it, telling myself it was nothing, just the natural stillness of the wilderness. But something lingered in the back of my mind, a feeling that I couldn't quite explain. That night, as I lay in bed trying to sleep, I kept hearing strange noises. Soft creaks from the wood, the occasional thump from outside, but nothing I could identify. I told myself it was just the wind or the settling of the cabin, but the more I listened, the more unsettled I became. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps outside the cabin, faint and slow. I held my breath, straining to hear more, but the sound never came again. I convinced myself it was just an animal, perhaps a deer or raccoon, and I eventually drifted off to sleep. The next day, the weather took a turn. The sky, which had been overcast the day before, now darkened with heavy clouds. The air grew thick and damp, the scent of rain in the air. Danny and I decided to fish despite the weather. We were already out on the boat by mid-morning, casting our lines into the water. The lake had taken on an even darker tone, the water now a deep, almost black hue mirroring the sky above. It was as if the lake had transformed overnight. The fishing was slower that day. I had a few bites, but nothing substantial. Danny, as usual, seemed to have the magic touch. He caught a few smaller fish, but nothing that would break any records. The lake was eerily quiet, and it wasn't just the lack of fish. There was no sign of life, no birds flying overhead, no rustling in the trees. It was as if everything had stopped moving. We fished for hours, but as the day wore on, an uncomfortable tension seemed to hang in the air. Around late afternoon, the weather began to worsen. The wind picked up and the first drops of rain began to fall. We decided to call it a day and headed back to the cabin. As we approached the dock, something caught my eye. A dark shape beneath the water, moving slowly just below the surface. At first, I thought it was a log, but then I saw it clearly. A large, shadowy form undulating in the water. It wasn't a fish. It wasn't anything I'd ever seen before. "Did you see that?" I asked, my voice a little unsteady. Danny didn't look up. "Probably just a log or some debris," he said, shrugging. But I could tell from his tone that he didn't believe that either. We got back to the cabin, and I couldn't shake the image of that dark shape beneath the water. I tried to push it from my mind, but it stuck with me. That night, as the storm raged outside, I found it harder to sleep. The wind howled through the trees, and the rain beat against the windows, but all I could think about was the lake and what I had seen. By the time morning came, the storm had passed, but the lake was still as dark and ominous as ever. The air was thick with mist, and the water was even more still than before. Danny and I decided to fish again, though neither of us seemed particularly enthusiastic about it. We pushed the boat out into the water, as casting our lines into the cold, murky depths. For a while, nothing happened. The lake remained unnervingly silent. But then, out of nowhere, Danny's rod jerked violently. He yanked it back, but something massive was pulling on the line. He struggled to reel it in, sweat beading on his forehead as the boat rocked back and forth. I grabbed the net, ready to help, but Danny was struggling with the line. Whatever it wasn't going down without a fight. Suddenly, the line snapped. Gas! And Danny was thrown back, the rod flying from his hands. I scrambled to catch it, but the damage was done. The lake was still again, the surface calm as if nothing had happened. "What the hell was that?" I asked, my heart pounding. Danny was silent for a long moment, his face pale. "I've never felt anything like that before," he said, his voice tight. "It didn't feel like a fish. It felt different." We didn't fish much after that. We packed up our gear and headed back to the cabin. The rest of the day passed in uneasy silence. The storm had left the air thick with an oppressive stillness. Neither of us spoke about what had happened, but we both felt it. Something was wrong with that lake. We stayed one more night in the cabin, but we didn't go back out onto the water. The next morning, we packed our things and left. Neither of us ever spoke about the trip again. The memory of the dark shape beneath the water and the massive force we couldn't even begin to explain haunted me for years. I never went fishing at Blackwater Lake again. To this day, I don't know what we encountered out there. But whatever it was, it didn't want us there. Story. The end.
Story number 3.
It started as the perfect weekend trip. 3 of us, me, my cousin Dan, and his friend Eric, set out for a remote fishing spot deep in the forests of northern Maine. Dan had heard about the place from some old-timers who swore by it, a lake so hidden that it didn't show up on most maps. They called it Deadwater Lake. The name wasn't exactly inviting, but according to them, the fish there were massive, untouched by the usual crowds of weekend anglers. We packed light, just tents, fishing gear, and enough supplies for 3 days. The drive was long, mostly dirt roads and washed-out trails, until we reached a point where the truck couldn't go any further. From there, we had to hike. It took nearly 4 hours through thick, silent woods before we finally saw the lake. It was eerie. The water was completely still, like glass. No birds, no buzzing insects, just silence, broken only by our boots crunching against the gravelly shore. Dan was the first to break the quiet. "Place looks untouched," he said, dropping his pack. Eric, always the skeptic, scoffed, "Or abandoned for a reason." We laughed, shaking off the uneasy feeling, and got to work setting up camp near the shore. By late afternoon, we had our lines in the water, and the stories weren't lies. Within minutes, Dan hooked a fish so big it nearly yanked the rod from his hands, a 20-pound lake trout. I pulled in something just as large soon after. The thrill of the catch wiped away any unease, and by nightfall we had a roaring fire, fresh fish cooking, and a few beers cracked open. But the silence never left. No crickets, no distant calls of loons, just the crackling of our fire and the occasional splash from the lake. Then, just as I was about to turn in for the night, I heard something from the water. A deep, slow ripple, like something large shifting beneath the surface. I turned my flashlight toward the lake. Nothing. But I swear, for just a second, I saw something pale just below the water, vanishing into the depths. Probably a log, Dan muttered sleepily when I told him. I wanted to believe that. The second day was just as good for fishing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. I kept catching movement from the corner of my eye, just at the tree line. Shadows shifting, darting between the trees. But every time I turned my head, nothing was there. Eric was the first to voice what I was thinking. "We're being watched," he said bluntly while cleaning a fish. Dan snorted. "By what? Bears?" Eric shook his head. "No, something else." That night, I barely slept. Around 3 a.m, I woke up to the sound of soft splashing. Not the sharp, natural plop of a fish breaking the surface, but something slow, deliberate. I sat up, heart hammering, and unzipped the tent just enough to peer out. The moon was bright, lighting up the water in a silver glow, and that's when I saw it. Something was standing in the lake. At first I thought it was a person, but no one else was up. Then I realized its legs weren't breaking the surface. They just faded into the water. It was tall, unnaturally thin, with pale, almost translucent skin. Long, wet hair clung to its face, and though I couldn't make out eyes, I knew it was looking at me. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. Then it started to turn, not walking, just shifting, as if the water itself moved it. I scrambled backward, shaking Dan awake. "Something's out there." By the time he sat up, it was gone. The lake was still again, as if nothing had ever been there. Morning came with a heavy fog. None of us mentioned the night before, but I knew Eric hadn't slept either. We made the quiet decision to pack up early. As we were loading our packs, Eric stopped suddenly, staring at the ground near the shore. Bare footprints, leading from the water to our tents. But here's the thing. There were no footprints going back. We left without looking back, hiking the 4 hours in near silence. We never spoke about it again. I tried looking up Deadwater Lake when we got back, but I found almost nothing. No mentions of it in any fishing records, no camping reports, no maps. It was like the place didn't exist. Or maybe, like whatever was in that lake, it just didn't want to be found. Story the end.
Story number 4.
The rain had stopped just an hour before I arrived at Black Hollow Lake, but the sky was still heavy with the promise of more. The thick, damp air smelled of wet leaves and earth, the kind of scent that sticks to your clothes and lingers in your lungs. I parked my truck on the gravel shoulder of the access road, stepping out into the kind of silence only found deep in the wilderness. I had heard stories about this lake, mostly whispered rumors from old-timers at the bait shop. "People go missing up there," one of them had said, shaking his head over a cup of stale coffee. "They just vanish. No wreckage, no bodies, nothing." Another man, his face leathery from years of sun and wind, had scoffed, but refused to say more. I had laughed it off, of course. Every lake has its ghost stories, especially the ones far off the beaten path. But there was something about the way they said it, low and serious, like they were warning me. Still, I had made up my mind. Black Hollow was supposed to have some of the best fishing in the state, and I wasn't going to let a few spooky stories keep me from checking it out. Besides, I was alone, and I preferred it that way. No distractions, just me, my rod, and the water. I loaded up my gear, double-checking everything. Tackle box, extra line, bait, a few beers, and of course, my knife. Not that I expected to need it, but years of hiking and fishing alone had taught me to never go unprepared. I slung my backpack over one shoulder and started down the trail toward the lake. The sound of my boots crunching on damp leaves echoed in the stillness, and for the first time I felt the weight of the place pressing down on me. The lake was more beautiful than I expected. The water was black as ink, mirroring the trees that surrounded it. There was no wind, no ripples, just a perfect, undisturbed surface. It looked almost unnatural, like a piece of glass laid over a deep hole. I swallowed down the unease creeping up my spine and made my way to the small wooden dock that jutted out into the lake. It looked old but sturdy enough, the planks slick from the rain. I set down my gear, pulled out my rod, and cast my line. The lure hit the water with a soft plop, sending out tiny rings that quickly disappeared into the blackness. I exhaled, letting the tension ease from my shoulders. This was what I came for. For a long while, nothing happened. The lake remained eerily still. No fish jumped, no insects buzzed. It was as if the place was frozen, waiting. Then, just as I was about to reel in and try another spot, something tugged. Hard. I grinned, setting the hook. Whatever was on the other end was strong, fighting me with a kind of wild energy I hadn't felt before. I braced my feet, my heart pounding as I worked to bring it in. The line cut through the water in erratic bursts, the fish struggling as if its life depended on it, which of course it did. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the fight stopped. The line went completely slack. I frowned, reeling in quickly. Maybe it had snapped free, but as I pulled the line in, I realized my lure was still intact. No break, no bite marks, just the untouched bait. I shook off the unease, casting again and again. Each time, the same thing happened. A powerful strike, a brutal fight, then nothing. It was like something was toying with me. The sun began to dip below the trees, the sky bleeding into deep purples and reds. I should have packed up, but frustration kept me rooted in place. I was determined to land whatever was out there. I cast one last time. The line jerked so hard it nearly wrenched the rod from my hands. I gritted my teeth, holding on as the reel screamed. This was it. This was the one. I dug my heels in, fighting against the pull. Whatever was on the other end was massive, stronger than anything I had ever hooked before. My arms burned, but I kept at it, inching it closer and closer. Then, for the first time since I arrived, the water moved. A slow ripple, then a break in the surface, just a shadow at first, something rising from the depths. My stomach clenched as I caught a glimpse of it beneath the water. It wasn't a fish. The shape was wrong, too long, too sinuous. It coiled and twisted, its form shifting unnaturally. Then, in one violent motion, it surged upward. A pale, bloated face broke through the water, its mouth gaping open in a silent scream, eyes clouded and lifeless. A hand, waterlogged and twisted, reached up from beneath the surface, gripping my line. I stumbled back, the rod slipping from my grasp as the thing let out a guttural, bubbling moan. It wasn't just one. More shapes lurched beneath the water, writhing just out of sight. I turned and ran. I don't remember grabbing my gear. I don't remember making it back to my truck. But suddenly, I was there, throwing myself inside and locking the doors, my chest heaving. I didn't look back as I tore down the dirt road, the lake vanishing in my rearview mirror. I never went back to Black Hollow. Never spoke of it. But sometimes in the dead of night, I dream of hands reaching out from the water, of mouths frozen in silent screams. And I know whatever I saw that day is still there, waiting beneath the surface. Story the end.
Story number 5.
It started with a whisper, or at least that's what I remember most. The way the wind carried a sound too human to be the rustling of trees, but too inhuman to be anything else. I should start at the beginning. 3 years ago, my friend James and I planned a fishing trip to a remote lake deep in the heart of the Appalachian wilderness. It was one of those places you had to hike to, miles away from civilization, where the water was so still it looked like glass, and the fish were rumored to be as big as dogs. We had been planning the trip for months, eager to get away from our mundane lives and experience something raw, untouched, and maybe, just maybe, catch the biggest fish of our lives. James had found the location through an old forum post, buried in a thread about forgotten fishing spots. The post was vague, almost intentionally so, only giving rough GPS coordinates and a cryptic warning. The lake is deep, but it remembers. I take nothing but fish, leave nothing but footsteps. We laughed about it at the time. Just some local trying to keep the spot a secret, we assumed. Packing light, we brought only the essentials: tents, food, our fishing gear, and a satellite phone for emergencies. The hike was grueling, the kind that made you regret your life choices halfway through. But when we reached the lake, it was worth it. It was beautiful. The water was black, so black it absorbed the sky. There was no reflection, no shimmer, just an endless void of liquid darkness. The surrounding trees were ancient, their roots thick and gnarled, twisting into the earth like skeletal fingers. Everything was still, eerily so, as if the entire forest was holding its breath. We should have turned back then. The first night was uneventful. Just two friends drinking cheap beer and swapping stories by the fire. We cast our lines into the black water, watching the moonlight glisten off the ripples. Around midnight, I caught something, a big one. The fight was intense, my hands aching as I reeled it in. But when I pulled it from the water, my excitement turned to unease. The fish was pale, not just light-colored, but white, its scales almost translucent. Its eyes were cloudy, milky, as if it had been swimming blind for years. There was something unnatural about it, something wrong. James waved it off, joking that I had caught some kind of mutant. I wanted to throw it back, but James insisted we keep it. "Biggest catch of the night," he said, grinning. "We have to eat it." The thought made my stomach twist, but I agreed. We gutted it, skewered it over the fire, and ate. It tasted off. Not rotten, but too fresh, too raw, even though it was fully cooked. The texture was wrong, like biting into something still alive. That night, I had dreams. Strange, suffocating dreams of water filling my lungs, of voices whispering in a language I couldn't understand. I woke up gasping, my skin damp with sweat. Across the fire, James was still asleep, but his breathing was shallow, his face twisted in discomfort. Then I heard it, a splash. Not the small plunk of a fish jumping, but something larger, heavier. It came from the lake, just beyond the shore. I turned my flashlight toward the water. Something was floating there. At first, I thought it was another fish, but as my eyes adjusted, I realized it was too big, too human. It was a shape, pale and bloated, its limbs barely visible beneath the surface. It drifted toward us, slow, deliberate. I took a step back, my heart hammering. Then it moved. Not floating, not carried by the current, but moving on its own. And then it was gone. The water was still again, as if nothing had been there at all. I barely slept after that. The next morning, I told James what I saw. He laughed it off, calling it a nightmare. But he looked sick, his skin pale, his eyes shadowed. He said he felt cold, even though the sun was blazing overhead. We decided to fish again, trying to shake off the unease. I refused to eat anything we caught, but James wasn't as cautious. He was starving, he said, ravenous. He ate and ate, barely even chewing. By noon, he started complaining about a headache. By evening, he was vomiting blood. I panicked, digging out the satellite phone. No signal. We were too deep in the woods, too far from any tower. James got worse. His skin was turning gray, his veins darkening beneath the surface. His eyes, his eyes were turning milky white, just like the fish. That night, the whispering returned. It came from the lake, a low, guttural murmur that seemed to vibrate through the trees. It was calling his name. James, James, James. I shook him awake, but he was burning up, his body writhing in pain. He gripped my arm, his fingers unnaturally cold. "It wants me," he croaked. "It's calling me." I tried to keep him in the tent, but sometime in the night, he left. I woke up to the sound of splashing. I ran to the shore, my flashlight slicing through the dark. James was in the water, waist deep, his back to me. "James!" I screamed. He didn't respond. I ran to him, grabbing his arm, trying to pull him back. His skin was slick, like it was covered in some kind of film. His breath was ragged, his chest rising and falling in short, shallow bursts. Then he turned around, and I swear to God, it wasn't James anymore. His mouth was too wide, stretched in an unnatural grin. His teeth, what was left of them, were sharp, jagged. His eyes were gone, just empty sockets filled with black, inky water. He grabbed me with strength that wasn't his, pulled me toward the lake. I fought. I fought harder than I ever had in my life. I don't remember how, but I broke free. I ran. I didn't stop running until I saw the sunrise. I made it back to civilization half mad with terror. I told the rangers everything, but when they searched the lake, they found nothing. No James, no signs of struggle, but they did find one thing, a fish. A pale, milky-eyed fish, still gasping for breath on the shore. Inside its stomach, they found human teeth. I don't go fishing anymore. Story, the end.
Story number 6.
The wind rolled off the lake in eerie, rhythmic bursts, carrying the scent of damp earth and rotting leaves. Ethan adjusted his grip on the fishing rod, eyes scanning the black water. The moon was a thin crescent, barely strong enough to cast light across the still surface. It was the perfect night for fishing, quiet, isolated, and unsettlingly still. He had come out here alone, just as he always did. Fishing was his escape from the stress of the city, the never-ending demands of work, and the noise that never seemed to stop. Out here, it was just him, the water, and the quiet hum of nature. He had found this secluded spot last summer, an old, abandoned dock deep in the woods, far from the more popular fishing spots. It was perfect, too perfect. Ethan set his tackle box beside him and cast his line. The plop of the bait breaking the water's surface was the only sound for miles. The quiet was absolute, and as he sat there, staring at the water, a deep chill ran down his spine. Something about tonight felt off. Shaking the feeling, he reached for his thermos and took a long sip of coffee. The warmth did little to drive away the creeping unease, though. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the reeds along the shore. Then, suddenly, a tug. Ethan grinned, setting his thermos down and gripping the rod with both hands. Whatever was on the other end was strong. He tightened his grip and began reeling, muscles straining against the pull. The water churned, but he couldn't see what he'd hooked. It was too dark. The line went taut, almost impossibly so, bending his rod dangerously. "What the hell?" he muttered. Then the line snapped. Ethan stumbled back, nearly losing his balance on the slick wood of the dock. He swore under his breath, shaking his head in disbelief. That was no ordinary fish. He had felt it. It was too heavy, too powerful. His heart pounded as he hurried to re-rig his line, hands trembling slightly. He told himself it was just adrenaline, but deep down he knew it was more than that. There was something in that water. He cast again, his bait vanishing into the abyss. Minutes passed. Then another tug. This time it was gentler, almost teasing. Ethan pulled back slightly, feeling the resistance, but something was wrong. It wasn't struggling like a fish should. It was just pulling. Then the line started moving. Not jerking like a fish fighting for freedom, but dragging, as if something was slowly, deliberately pulling it away. Ethan's breath hitched. He tried to reel in, but it was like reeling against dead weight. His pulse pounded in his ears as the line suddenly slackened. He pulled, and something heavy surfaced. A shape. At first, he thought it was a large fish, but as it floated closer to the dock, the moonlight revealed something far worse. It was a human hand. Ethan recoiled, nearly dropping the rod. The hand, pale and bloated, bobbed in the water, fingers stiff in a grotesque curl. Then, slowly, as if something beneath the surface still clung to it, the hand sank. The water swallowed it whole. Ethan scrambled back, breath coming in short gasps. He fumbled for his flashlight, hands shaking violently. He shone it at the water, searching for any sign of what he had just seen. Nothing. The lake was still again. He needed to leave. Now. He grabbed his tackle box and turned, but as he did, a soft sound made him freeze. A splash! Not a fish jumping. Not the wind disturbing the surface. A deep, slow, deliberate splash. Like footsteps. Ethan turned back, the flashlight trembling in his grip. Ripples spread across the water, coming from the center of the lake. Then another splash. Closer. His pulse thundered in his ears. He shined the light along the water's surface, and his breath caught in his throat. Something was emerging. At first, it looked like a mass of tangled weeds rising from the depths, dripping and black. But then he saw it. A face. A grotesquely pale, waterlogged face with hollow, black pits where the eyes should be. Ethan's paralysis shattered. He bolted for his truck, heart hammering against his ribs. The path through the trees was uneven. the roots threatening to trip him with every step. Behind him, he heard it, the sound of something moving through the water, something dragging itself onto the shore. He didn't look back. His truck was parked just up the hill. He fumbled for his keys, breath ragged, hands slick with sweat. Something crunched in the underbrush behind him. He slammed the door shut and locked it. His fingers jabbed at the ignition and the engine roared to life. His headlights cut through the darkness, revealing the dirt road ahead. But just as he shifted into drive, something flashed in his peripheral vision. In the rearview mirror, something stood at the edge of the trees. It was barely visible, just a silhouette against the blackness. But he saw the outline of its face, the gaping holes where its eyes should be. Then it moved. Ethan floored it, tires kicking up dirt and gravel. He didn't stop. Not until he was miles away, back in town, where the streetlights and familiar sounds of civilization made him feel safe again. He never went back to that lake. But sometimes, in the silence of the night, he could still hear it, the slow, deliberate splashing, and he knew whatever was in that water, whatever he had almost pulled up from the depths, was still waiting for someone else to cast their line. Story the end.
Story number 7.
It was a crisp autumn morning when I decided to go out on the lake. The leaves had just started turning, and the air had that familiar chill to it that made fishing in the quiet of the morning feel all the more peaceful. I had been planning this trip for weeks, a quiet weekend away from the grind of the city, just me, my old fishing rod, and the calm waters of Lake Dreer. It wasn't a lake most people knew about, one of those off-the-beaten-path places that only locals talked about. I had been fishing there with my grandfather when I was a kid, and it had always been a place where I could think, relax, and feel at peace. This trip, though, would turn out to be different from anything I could have imagined. I had no idea that by the end of the weekend I would be questioning everything I thought I knew about the natural world. I woke up early, the light just beginning to peek through the trees. It was still dark, but the morning was close, and I could feel the promise of a good day ahead. I packed my gear into my truck, tackle box, rods, cooler with sandwiches, and set off for the lake. It was about a 2-hour drive through winding back roads, past small farms and thick woods. By the time I got there, the sun had begun to rise in earnest, the light dancing across the water in golden waves. It was beautiful, but there was an odd stillness in the air that I couldn't shake. I unloaded the truck and made my way down to the dock. There was no one else around, which suited me just fine. Lake Dreer had always been a secluded spot. Not many people knew about it or cared to venture out this far. That's how I liked it. I launched the boat, a small aluminum rowboat I had rented for the weekend, and paddled out into the center of the lake. It was peaceful, and for a moment, I let the rhythmic dip of the oars relax me. There was no sound except the water lapping gently at the sides of the boat and the occasional bird call in the distance. I fished for hours, and though I didn't catch anything significant, it didn't matter. I wasn't here to fill the cooler. I was here to be alone, to enjoy the quiet, to feel connected to something bigger than myself. I let the time slip away, drifting along, occasionally reeling in a small perch or bass and tossing it back into the water. But then, around noon, something changed. I had been drifting farther from shore, closer to the center of the lake. It was then I noticed the fog. At first, it was just a light mist, barely enough to obscure the water's surface. But it thickened rapidly, and within minutes I could barely see the shoreline. The water became unnervingly still, as though the fog itself had trapped the lake in a vice. I pulled in my line and sat still, watching the fog roll in. It was so thick that the air seemed to press in on me, heavy and oppressive. I could no longer hear any birds or animals. The entire world seemed muffled, as if nature itself had fallen silent. I don't know how long I sat there, but after a while, I felt the unmistakable sensation of being watched. It was subtle at first, just a tingling on the back of my neck, but it grew more intense, more overwhelming, as if something was standing just out of sight, observing me. I kept my eyes on the shore, my heart starting to pound, but saw nothing. No movement. No signs of life. Then I heard it. A sound from beneath the water. At first, I thought it was just a fish, but this wasn't the sound of a fish jumping or splashing. It was something else. The water seemed to ripple unnaturally, not from any breeze or passing boat, but from something large beneath the surface, something that moved with purpose. My mind raced as I stared down at the dark water, my hand instinctively gripping the paddle, ready to push the boat away if I needed to. The sound grew louder, more distinct. It was as if something was swimming beneath the boat, circling, something enormous. My stomach turned as the unmistakable feeling of dread settled in my chest. I glanced over my shoulder at the mist. It had grown thicker, darker, almost as if it was moving closer, enclosing me. I snapped back to the water just in time to see something large pass beneath the boat. It was brief but unmistakable, something dark, massive, swimming with incredible speed and power just beneath the surface. My breath caught in my throat. There was no way a fish that big could be in this lake. Lake Dreer was known for being home to bass, perch, and trout. Nothing that could account for what I had just seen. My mind raced, trying to come up with a logical explanation, but I couldn't. There was nothing natural about the way it moved. I immediately began paddling toward the shore, my heart pounding in my chest. The fog, however, seemed to have other ideas. It rolled in thicker, faster, and I couldn't see the shoreline anymore. I was disoriented, unable to make out which direction I was heading. The water around me was unnervingly still now, and the only sound was the soft plip of my paddle cutting through the water. I had no idea how far I had drifted from the dock, but it felt as if the entire lake had grown silent, waiting. I paddled harder, panic beginning to rise in my throat. I needed to get back to the dock. The feeling of being watched, of something lurking just beneath the surface, was unbearable. And then I heard it again, another ripple. It was subtle at first, like the swish of something moving just below the water. But then it grew louder, more distinct, and suddenly I felt the boat lurch. I froze. My heart skipped a beat as the boat rocked slightly, a sharp, sudden pull beneath the surface, as though something had brushed against it. The water around me stirred, and for a moment I thought I saw something in the mist, something dark, massive, with long, twisting shapes writhing beneath the surface. I wasn't sure if it was my mind playing tricks on me, but I felt an undeniable terror sweep through me. I needed to get out of there. I began to paddle harder, my breath coming in shallow gasps, my hands slipping on the wet paddle. The boat lurched again, harder this time, and I was sure something was beneath me, something enormous, waiting. I glanced behind me, and through the fog I saw a dark shape moving toward me, fast, too fast for any fish I knew. My eyes went wide, and I paddled desperately toward the shore, but the shape followed, closing in. My heart was in my throat, and for the first time in my life, I felt truly helpless. The boat rocked violently again, and I heard a loud splash. My eyes shot to the water behind me, and for a split second, I thought I saw something large breach the surface, a massive shape just below the waterline. The mist seemed to swirl around it like a cloak, and I realized with horror that it was coming for me. I wasn't going to wait to find out what it was. With panic flooding my system, I turned the boat around and began paddling with everything I had. The water was churning beneath me now, and I could feel the boat rocking dangerously, as if something was pushing it from below. But no matter how hard I paddled, the shore never seemed to get closer. It wasn't until the boat suddenly jolted again that I finally broke. The boat tipped violently to the side, throwing me into the water. Cold shock seized my body as I hit the frigid water, and I gasped for air. I fought against the shock, struggling to stay afloat, but the lake was pulling me under. Something was there. I could feel it circling beneath me, and I could hear it. The deep rumbling growl from below. It was almost as if the lake itself was alive, and whatever was in it was toying with me. I swam with everything I had, kicking and paddling, but the pull of the water was too strong. I glanced back, and the fog seemed to be closing in, swallowing me whole. I don't know how I made it back to shore, but I did. When my feet finally hit the ground, I collapsed, gasping for air, my heart still pounding in my chest. I looked back at the lake, but all I could see was mist. The water was still. I don't know what happened that day. I don't know if it was a trick of the fog, if it was something real, or just my mind playing games. But I've never gone back to Lake Dreer since that day, and I never will. What I encountered out there, what I felt in the water, I can't explain. But I know that it wasn't a fish, and it wasn't a trick of nature. Something else is out there, and I'm not brave enough to go looking for it again. Story the end.
Story number 8.
I've been fishing since I was a kid. It's always been my way of escaping. Just me, the water, and the quiet. Nothing else mattered when I had a rod in my hands. But what happened that summer changed everything. I haven't fished since. It was mid-July, the heat sitting thick in the air like a blanket. My buddy Mark and I had planned a weekend trip up to Alder Lake, a secluded reservoir about 40 miles from town. We'd fished there plenty of times, but always from the shore. This time, Mark's uncle had lent us an old aluminum boat, and we were determined to hit the deep spots where the big fish were. We left early Saturday morning, the truck bed loaded with gear, coolers, and enough beer to last the weekend. The drive was long, winding through stretches of dense pine forest. We passed only a few other cars on the way, mostly campers and old-timers towing small boats like ours. By the time we got to the lake, the sun was already high. The water stretched out before us, calm and dark, its surface reflecting the towering evergreens that surrounded it. It looked like glass, undisturbed, peaceful. We backed the boat into the water, tossed in our gear, and shoved off from the little gravel shoreline. There was something about being on the lake, away from everything, that always made me feel at ease. No deadlines, no responsibilities, just the rhythmic slap of water against the hull. We rowed out about 100 yards, stopping near a small inlet where the water was deep but not too far from shore. The fish were biting right away. Within an hour, Mark had pulled in a few decent-sized trout, and I'd hooked a monster bass that fought like hell before snapping my line. Around mid-afternoon, the air shifted. The wind died down completely, and the lake's surface went from choppy to eerily still. Even the usual sounds of the forest, birds, rustling leaves, the occasional splash, just stopped. Mark noticed it too. "Man, it's quiet out here." I nodded. "Too quiet." He chuckled, but it was nervous. Probably just the weather. Storm might be coming in. I wasn't convinced. Something about the silence felt wrong. It wasn't just that the birds had stopped. It was like the whole lake was holding its breath. I tried to shake the feeling and focused on my line. The afternoon dragged on, the sun dipping lower. Then, just as I was starting to relax, I saw it. A ripple, about 50 yards from the boat. Not a normal ripple. It was wide, slow, like something big had moved just beneath the surface. Mark saw it too. "Did you see that?" His voice was tight. I nodded. My grip on the rod tightened. Then, another ripple. Closer. Mark grabbed the oars. "Maybe we should move." I didn't argue. The feeling in my gut had twisted into something cold. I pulled in my line as Mark started rowing, the boat rocking slightly with each stroke. Then the smell hit us. Rot, like something had been dead in the sun for days. Mark gagged, covering his nose. "Jesus, what is that?" I turned my head, scanning the water, and that's when I saw it. A shape rising from the depths. At first, my brain tried to make sense of it. It looked like a log, slick and dark, floating just beneath the surface. But then it moved, and I saw the eyes. Pale, almost white, set deep into a swollen face. A face that looked human. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. The thing bobbed in the water, its bloated mouth hanging open. Mark dropped the oars. "Oh, fuck!" The boat lurched as he scrambled backward, nearly tipping us. My pulse pounded in my ears as I forced myself to move. I grabbed the oars and rowed. Fast. The boat groaned as it cut through the water, but no matter how hard I rowed, the smell wouldn't leave. The thing wouldn't leave. Then, a splash. I didn't look. I couldn't. Mark did. And the scream that came from him wasn't human. I rowed harder. "Go! Go! Go!" he shrieked, his voice cracking. I didn't ask questions. I didn't stop. I just kept moving until we hit the shore so hard the boat nearly flipped. We jumped out, stumbling onto the gravel, gasping for breath. Mark was shaking. His face was pale, his eyes wide with terror. I turned back to the lake, heart hammering. The water was still again, like nothing had ever happened. The smell was gone, the ripples had vanished. But I knew what I had seen, what we had seen. Mark wouldn't talk about it. Not that night, not the next day, not even after we packed up and left, driving in silence all the way home. I tried looking up old news reports, drownings, missing persons, anything that might explain what we saw. But there was nothing. No records, no reports. Just a deep, quiet lake that swallowed its secrets whole. I haven't been back to Alder Lake. Haven't picked up a rod since, because sometimes the water gives and sometimes it takes. Story the end.
Story number 9.
Here's your full-length fishing horror story. There are places on this earth that people don't belong. I learned that the hard way. I was 16 when it happened, but I remember every detail like it was yesterday. My Uncle Mike had invited me on a fishing trip to a secluded lake up north. He was one of those rugged, no-nonsense outdoorsmen, the kind who could gut a deer with his eyes closed and tie a fishing knot in the dark. He'd grown up in these woods, knew them better than anyone, and if he thought this lake was worth the trip, I wasn't about to argue. We packed light, fishing gear, a tent, some canned food, and enough beer for Mike to get buzzed but not drunk. The drive took most of the day, deep into the wilderness where the roads turned from gravel to dirt, and finally to little more than a path hacked through the trees. "Last chance to back out, kid," Mike joked as he killed the engine. I laughed, shaking my head. "No way. I've been waiting for this all summer." The woods were eerily quiet as we unloaded the truck, the kind of silence that makes you feel like you're being watched. It wasn't until we started hiking toward the lake that I noticed the smell. A damp, musty odor, like rotting leaves and something else, something sour. I wrinkled my nose. "You smell that?" I asked. Mike sniffed the air and frowned. "Swamp gas, maybe. These old lakes sometimes stink, especially if they don't get much movement." That seemed reasonable enough, so I let it go. After nearly an hour of hiking, we finally reached the lake. It was beautiful, in a way that made my stomach twist with unease. The water was too still, like a sheet of black glass reflecting the trees perfectly. No ripples, no fish jumping, no birds skimming the surface. It was unnatural. Mike didn't seem bothered. "Perfect spot," he said, dropping his gear. "Let's get set up." We pitched the tent near the shore and got a fire going. As the sun dipped lower, the shadows stretched long over the water. I sat on a fallen log tying my line when I saw it, just a flicker of movement out of the corner of my eye. Something in the water. I turned quickly, but the surface was still. Mike must have seen the look on my face. "Something wrong?" I hesitated, then shook my head. "Thought I saw something. Probably just a fish." Mike chuckled. "Well, that's what we're here for." As night fell, we sat by the fire, cooking the fish we'd caught. The food helped settle my nerves, but something still felt off. The air was too heavy, the trees too quiet. It was like the whole forest was holding its breath. Then, somewhere across the lake, something screamed. It wasn't a coyote. I'd heard plenty of coyotes before. This was different. Low and guttural, almost human, but not quite. It echoed over the water, sending a chill up my spine. Mike stiffened, staring into the dark. "What the hell was that?" I whispered. Mike didn't answer right away. He just reached for his rifle. "Probably a bobcat," he muttered, but I could hear the doubt in his voice. The fire crackled between us. We listened, but the scream didn't come again. After a long silence, Mike sighed. "We'll keep the fire going. Nothing will come near us while it's burning." That should have made me feel better. It didn't. I crawled into the tent, but I couldn't sleep. Every time I started to drift off, I swore I could hear something moving outside. Slow, deliberate steps crunching the leaves, a faint, wheezing breath just beyond the fabric of the tent. I wanted to wake Mike, but I couldn't move. My body was frozen, my mind screaming at me to stay quiet. At some point, exhaustion won. I woke up to the sound of splashing. It was early, just before dawn, when the sky was still a deep blue. The fire was just embers now. Mike was gone. I sat up quickly, heart hammering. "Mike?" No answer. I crawled out of the tent and scanned the shoreline. That's when I saw him. He was standing knee-deep in the water, facing away from me, perfectly still. "Mike!" I called. Nothing. Something was wrong. His arms hung at his sides, limp, his head tilted slightly like he was listening to something I couldn't hear. A cold wave of fear rolled through me. I stepped closer. "Mike, what the hell are you doing?" His shoulders twitched. Slowly, he turned his head, just enough for me to see his face. His eyes were wide, unfocused. His lips moved, but no sound came out. His skin was pale, clammy, like he'd been standing in the cold for hours. And then I saw his feet. They weren't touching the bottom. He was floating. My breath caught in my throat. A hand, a long, thin, clawed hand, was wrapped around his ankle just beneath the surface. Before I could react, he was yanked under. I sprinted to the edge of the water, but he was gone. The lake was still again, as if nothing had happened. Panic took over. I grabbed a branch and plunged it into the water, feeling for anything, but the lake was too deep. I backed away, chest heaving, my hands shaking so hard I nearly dropped the branch. My mind raced. I had to do something. Call for help, find a way to. Then behind me, footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from the woods. I turned. A figure stood at the tree line. Tall, thin. Its limbs were too long, its skin stretched tight over sharp bones. It had no eyes, just hollow pits where they should have been. Its mouth was too wide, filled with jagged teeth. It didn't move. It just watched me. I took a step back. It took a step forward. I ran. I don't remember the hike back to the truck. My mind has blocked most of it out. I just remember the feeling of being chased, the breath on my neck, the whispers in the trees. I made it to the truck, threw myself inside, and tore down the dirt road, never looking back. Mike was never found. The official story was that he drowned, that he must have gone out for a morning swim and gotten pulled under, but I know better. Something took him. I don't go into the woods anymore. I don't fish, I don't camp. And every night I dream of the lake, of the thing standing at the tree line, of Mike's empty eyes staring up at me from the black water. Story the end.
Story number 10.
I've been fishing for as long as I can remember. It's always been my escape. Just me, the water, and the rhythm of casting and reeling. I've fished lakes, rivers, even deep sea once, but nothing ever scared me like what happened that summer at Grayson Lake. I don't talk about it much, and to this day I haven't been back. Grayson Lake sits in a quiet part of Kentucky, a man-made reservoir built in the 60s when the government flooded an old valley town. The stories say there are still buildings under there, houses, barns, even a church with its steeple just a few feet below the surface in the deepest part. I always thought that was just local folklore, something to scare kids from swimming too far out. That summer, I was 24, home from work for the weekend, and looking to fish. My friend Todd called me up on a Friday evening. "Hey, you down for a night fishing trip?" Todd was the only guy I knew who enjoyed night fishing more than daytime. Said the catfish hit harder after dark. I wasn't usually a fan. Something about sitting in the pitch black over deep water unsettled me, but I agreed. He had a small bass boat, and it beat sitting at home. We met at the dock around 8 p.m., just as the sun was dipping behind the hills. The lake was calm, reflecting the orange sky in a way that made it look like glass. There weren't many other boats out, just a few stragglers heading back in before dark. Perfect night for it, Todd grinned, tossing the cooler into the boat. No wind, no people. I nodded, loading my tackle box. Let's hope the fish think so too. We set off toward a spot Todd swore by, a cove tucked between steep limestone cliffs. The water there was deep, deeper than most of the lake, at least according to the depth finder. By the time we anchored, night had fully settled in. The stars were out, and the only sounds were the occasional splash of a fish or the quiet hum of insects from the shore. We fished for hours, catching a few decent-sized channel cats, but nothing special. Todd cracked open a beer and leaned back. "Ever hear the stories about this place?" he asked. I glanced at him. "What, the town under the lake?" He nodded, grinning. "Yeah, but not just that. They say some people never left." I rolled my eyes. "Come on, man." "I'm serious," he said. "My granddad told me that back when they flooded this place, some folks refused to move. Old-timers who didn't want to leave their land. The water just rose around them." I shook my head. "That's just some ghost story to keep kids from swimming too deep." Todd shrugged. "Maybe, but people have gone missing out here. A guy drowned just last year. They found his boat, but not him." I didn't respond, just cast my line again. That's when we heard it. A splash. Not the normal kind, not a fish jumping or a beaver tail slapping the water. This was different. Big, like someone had fallen in. Todd sat up. "Did you hear that?" I nodded, scanning the water. Then came the sound. A voice. Faint, garbled, like it was coming from underwater. "Help!" My blood turned to ice. Todd grabbed his flashlight and pointed it toward the shore, but there was nothing, just the still water and the dense trees beyond it. Then another splash. Closer. I yanked my line in. "Todd, let's go." He was already pulling up the anchor, his face pale. Then the boat rocked, like something had pushed it from below. Todd nearly dropped his flashlight. "What the hell was that?" I didn't answer. I was staring at the water, where something was rising. At first it looked like a log, dark, floating just beneath the surface. Then I saw the eyes, pale, sunken. staring up at me. My breath caught. My entire body screamed at me to move, but I couldn't. Then it rose higher, a face, bloated, waterlogged, with skin stretched too tight over its skull. Its mouth hung open as if frozen mid-scream, but the sound wasn't coming from it. The voice, the pleading voice, was still coming from beneath the water. I scrambled back. Go, go! Todd didn't hesitate. He jammed the throttle forward, and the boat lurched as we tore across the lake. The whole way back, neither of us spoke. We just watched. And in the boat's wake, in the rippling water, I swear I saw movement. Something slipping back into the depths. We hit the dock so fast we nearly beached the boat. Todd killed the engine, and we jumped out, our hands shaking as we tied it down. Finally, Todd looked at me, his face pale in the moonlight. You saw that, right? I nodded. Neither of us said anything else. We just packed up in silence and drove home. I haven't been back to Grayson Lake. I still fish, but never at night, because some things belong to the deep, and some voices aren't meant to be answered. Story the end.
Story number 11.
The first time I went fishing with Brad, I was still new to the area, having moved to the small town of Timber Hollow about 6 months earlier. Brad was a local, lived in Timber Hollow his whole life, a real outdoorsman, the kind of guy who could gut a fish before it even realized it was caught. He was always out in the wild, and I figured that since I had just moved from the city, he'd be the best person to show me the ropes. So, one Saturday morning, Brad invited me to go fishing with him at a remote lake up in the mountains. It was a place I'd never heard of before, and when I asked him how far it was, he just shrugged and said, "Not too far, just an hour or so." We packed up the truck with gear, snacks, and a couple of beers and set off early. The weather was perfect, cool with a slight breeze, and the kind of sunlight that made everything look golden. As we headed out of town, I noticed the landscape changing. The fields and homes slowly gave way to thicker woods, and the air seemed to grow denser, cooler. I didn't think much of it, just figured it was the mountain air. Brad, who was driving, didn't seem to mind the changing scenery, but there was something about it that made me feel uneasy. It was quiet, too quiet. I could hear the tires crunching over the gravel and the occasional call of a bird, but nothing else. The woods surrounding the road were dense, like the trees were closing in on us, their dark trunks standing in sharp contrast to the pale blue sky. "So, how long have you been fishing here?" I asked, trying to break the silence. "Been coming here since I was a kid," Brad replied, his eyes on the road ahead. "My old man used to bring me. He said this lake had the biggest fish in the county." He paused for a moment before adding, "But not many people know about it. Most of the locals avoid it." I raised an eyebrow. "Why's that?" Brad didn't answer right away. He just gave a small shrug, his hands tightening around the wheel. Finally, he spoke. "It's an old place. A lot of folks say the lake's got a bad reputation." "A bad reputation?" I repeated, intrigued. He glanced at me, a slight grin forming. "Nothing to worry about. Just local superstition. Some say the lake's cursed." I didn't press him for more details. People in small towns always had their weird beliefs. I figured it was just another one of those stories people tell to make a place seem mysterious. It wasn't long before we turned onto a narrow, winding dirt road that disappeared into the forest. The trees here were even thicker, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer, even though it was still early in the morning. I could feel the temperature drop as we moved deeper into the woods, the air growing thick and heavy, as if the trees themselves were closing in around us. "Almost there," Brad said, his voice sounding a little strained now. I glanced at him, noticing the slight tension in his posture. He was usually pretty laid back, but something about this place had him on edge. We finally reached the end of the road, where a small clearing opened up to reveal the lake. It was a beautiful sight at first glance. The water was dark and still, surrounded by towering pines and moss-covered rocks. The only sound was the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze and the distant call of a loon. Brad pulled the truck to a stop and parked. "Well, here we are," he said, getting out and unloading the gear. I stepped out of the truck, stretching my legs. Something about the place felt off. The silence was almost oppressive, and the air smelled earthy, like damp wood and decay. I shook off the feeling and followed Brad down to the shore, where he set up the rods. We fished for hours, but there wasn't much biting. It wasn't unusual, especially for a place this remote. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Brad seemed to be concentrating hard, his eyes constantly scanning the water. By late afternoon, I'd caught nothing. Neither had Brad, though he had seemed much more relaxed than he had been earlier. That's when it happened. Brad suddenly froze, his rod gripped tightly in his hands. His face drained of color as he stared intently at the water. "Brad?" I asked, concerned. "What is it?" He didn't answer. Instead, he stood up slowly, still staring at the water. Then he turned to me, his eyes wide and filled with fear. "We need to leave. Now." I was confused. "What? What's going on?" But Brad didn't answer. He quickly gathered his gear, not saying a word, and started heading back to the truck. I followed him, still unsure of what was happening. When we reached the truck, he threw everything into the back of the bed and slammed the tailgate shut. He didn't even start the engine at first. He just sat there, staring out into the trees. "What's wrong?" I asked again. Brad's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. "I don't know, man. Something's not right. I've been fishing here my whole life, and I've never felt like this before." He paused, swallowing hard. "There's something in that water." I looked at him, trying to process what he was saying. "What do you mean? A fish?" He shook his head, his face pale. "No, something else." I wanted to argue, to tell him it was probably just his imagination, but the fear in his eyes stopped me. Instead, I sat quietly in the passenger seat as he started the truck. We didn't speak the whole way back. Brad was driving fast, his eyes darting nervously to the rearview mirror every few seconds. When we finally reached the road that led out of the woods, Brad let out a long breath and slowed the truck. "Okay, we're good," he muttered, still glancing nervously over his shoulder. I was about to ask him what had really happened back at the lake when we heard it. A loud splash! It came from behind us, from the direction of the lake. The sound was followed by a low, guttural growl, so deep it seemed to reverberate in my bones. Brad's eyes widened in terror. "Drive! Now!" I didn't ask questions. He slammed the accelerator down and we sped out of the woods, the sound of the growl echoing in the distance. We didn't stop until we were back in Timber Hollow. Brad didn't even slow down as he turned onto his street. He parked the truck and sat there for a long time, staring straight ahead. Finally, he turned to me. "You won't go back there. Promise me." I didn't know what to say. There were no words for what had just happened, no way to explain the fear I saw in Brad's eyes, or the bone-chilling sound that still echoed in my mind. "I won't," I whispered, though I wasn't sure if I was promising him or myself. Brad never spoke of the lake again. I never went fishing with him again, either. And I don't think I ever will. Every time I pass the edge of Timber Hollow, where the trees start to get thick and dark, I think about that day, about the splash, about the growl, about whatever it was that lurked in the water, waiting for the next person to come too close. I never went near that lake again, and I never will. Story, the end.
As story number 12.
It was the summer of 1998 when I made the biggest mistake of my life. I was a seasoned fisherman, having spent years on the lakes and rivers of Michigan, but what I didn't know at the time was that there were some waters that no man was meant to fish. I had been staying in a small cabin on the outskirts of a little town called Vinton. It was the perfect spot for a weekend getaway. Isolated, quiet, and surrounded by the wild beauty of the forest. It wasn't a place that many people knew about, but that was just how I liked it. My friends would joke about me disappearing into the woods, but they didn't understand. Fishing was my escape. I had come across an old, hand-drawn map in a book I picked up at the local bookstore in town. It was a map of a small, forgotten lake, the kind of place that sounded too good to be true, hidden away in the woods, far from civilization. I had done some research when I got home and found that the lake, named Blackwater Lake, was rarely mentioned in modern guides. According to the few sources that did mention it, the fishing was outstanding and off the beaten path. That's all I needed to hear. I called up my buddy Ray, who was always game for a fishing trip, and we made plans for the weekend. Ray wasn't exactly a seasoned outdoorsman. He was more of the type to show up with a case of beer and a rod, hoping for the best. But he was a good guy, and we'd been fishing together for years. I figured this would be a nice chance to show him something new, and it had been a while since I had seen him. We arrived at the cabin Friday evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon. It was one of those warm, humid summer nights, the kind where the air feels heavy and the crickets chirp louder than usual. We didn't waste much time setting up. The cabin was small but cozy, with an old wood stove in the corner and a few mismatched chairs around a table. We cracked open a couple beers, ate some takeout, and talked about old times. After a couple hours, Ray said, "So, this Blackwater Lake, is it really as good as they say?" I smiled and leaned back in my chair. "That's what they say. I'm not sure, but there's only one way to find out." Ray laughed. "Hell yeah. Let's see what's in the water." We didn't waste any time the next morning. After a quick breakfast, we gathered our gear, tackle boxes, rods, some lures, and drove the hour or so to the lake. It wasn't easy to find, even with the map. The trail leading up to the lake was narrow and overgrown, and the last mile or so was nothing more than a dirt path that barely fit the truck. But eventually, we made it. When we arrived, I couldn't help but feel a sense of foreboding. The lake was beautiful, sure, but it was almost too still. The water was dark, almost black, with a slight sheen on the surface. The trees around the lake seemed unnaturally close, casting long shadows across the water. There was no sign of any other fishermen, no boats, no other vehicles, no sounds except for the wind rustling the leaves. Ray, who had been quiet since we arrived, finally spoke. "This place, it's kind of creepy, don't you think?" I waved it off. "Nah, it's just remote. That's what makes it perfect for fishing." We unloaded our gear and began to set up. Ray's unease was palpable, but I could tell he didn't want to seem scared. I, on the other hand, was itching to catch something big. I had heard rumors of massive bass and trophy pike in these waters, and I wasn't about to let a little tension get in the way. We fished for a couple of hours without much luck. There was something off about the lake. It wasn't just the stillness. There was a certain heaviness in the air, as if the water itself was somehow wrong. The longer we fished, the more uncomfortable I became. The silence was almost oppressive. No birds, no wildlife, not even the sound of fish jumping. It was as if the entire lake had been abandoned. But I pressed on, determined to catch something. Ray, on the other hand, wasn't as committed. He kept glancing over his shoulder, his eyes flicking nervously between the trees and the water. "You hear that?" he asked suddenly. I looked up, but the sound was gone. "What do you mean?" I thought I heard something, like footsteps, not just animals, but something heavier. I couldn't say I blamed him. The woods around the lake were dense, and the shadows were getting longer as the sun began to dip lower. But I chalked it up to his nerves. "I'm sure it's nothing," I said. "Let's keep fishing." We continued for another hour. As the sky darkened, we started packing up our gear. That's when I saw it. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught a glimpse of something large moving beneath the surface of the water. It was too quick to be a fish, too deliberate. I glanced over at Ray, but he was too busy stuffing lures back into his tackle box to notice. The movement was subtle, but unmistakable. I didn't want to make a big deal out of it, so I kept quiet, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was down there. Something big. I decided to cast one more time before we left. As I reeled in my line, something pulled back. Hard. My heart raced as I struggled to keep the line tight. It was like a tug of war, and whatever was on the other end was strong. I started reeling in with everything I had, but the pull kept coming. "Ray!" I shouted. "I think I've got something big." Ray looked up, startled, and quickly grabbed his rod. But before he could react, I felt the line snap. "What the hell?" I cursed. I pulled in the remaining line, but the hook had been completely mangled. It was as if something had bitten through it. Ray was silent for a moment, his eyes scanning the water. "Maybe it's just a big fish," he said, but his voice sounded uncertain. "I've never had a fish do that," I muttered, staring out at the water. It was then that I saw it, the thing, a massive shape, dark and unnatural, moving just beneath the surface. It wasn't a fish. It was too large, too fast. I could barely make out its outline, but it was something far beyond the size of anything I had ever seen before. It moved with an eerie, unnatural grace, and it seemed to be circling us. I felt a chill run down my spine. Ray, we need to get out of here," I said, my voice low. Ray turned toward the water, his face pale. "What the hell is that?" "I don't know, but it's not normal. It's time to go." We packed up in a hurry, but as we were about to leave, I heard it, a low, rumbling sound, almost like a growl coming from the water. My blood ran cold. Without another word, we got into the truck and drove off, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. The lake was behind us now, but the image of that shape in the water haunted me. We didn't speak much on the drive back to the cabin. There was nothing to say. I couldn't explain what had happened, and Ray couldn't either. All I knew was that whatever had been in that water, it wasn't something I wanted to mess with again. We stayed at the cabin that night, but neither of us slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear the sound of that growl. The next morning, we packed up and left without even saying goodbye to the cabin. I haven't been back to Blackwater Lake since, and I don't think I ever will. Some places are better left forgotten, and that lake, whatever's in there, is better left undisturbed. Story the end.
Story number 13.
It was supposed to be a relaxing weekend getaway, just me and my buddy Sam, fishing off the coast of Maine. Nothing serious, just a chance to unwind and get some fresh air. I didn't know it then, but that weekend would end up being the most terrifying experience of my life. Sam and I had known each other since high school, and while we didn't hang out as much after college, we always made time for fishing trips. There was something about the quiet of the water, the thrill of the catch, and the peace it gave me that made it feel like no time had passed. Sam was one of those guys who could find humor in anything. He was always cracking jokes, making the best of every situation. He had this infectious laugh that could make anyone feel at ease. This trip was no different. We'd rented a small cabin near the coast, right on the water, and brought a small boat with us. The idea was to spend the next few days fishing, like grilling whatever we caught, and forgetting about the stresses of life. The plan was simple, and it seemed perfect. We arrived on Friday afternoon. The sun was beginning its descent, casting a golden light over the water. The air smelled fresh, salty and clean, and the sound of the waves lapping against the shore was calming. Sam cracked open a beer as we unpacked the truck and set up the boat. "You think we'll catch anything today?" he asked, grinning. I shrugged. "We might get lucky." After setting up, we grabbed our rods and headed out into the bay. The water was calm, and there wasn't another boat in sight. I liked it that way. No distractions, just us and the open water. We cast our lines, settling into a quiet rhythm, letting the hours pass by as we talked about old times. The first few hours were uneventful. We caught a couple of small fish here and there, nothing worth writing home about. Sam was still cracking jokes, and I was content with the peacefulness of it all. The sun dipped lower in the sky, and the light on the water turned a deep orange, painting everything in a surreal glow. But then, just after sun, something changed. I was sitting back in my chair, relaxing, when I felt a tug on my line. It wasn't anything too big, but it was definitely stronger than a small fish. I began to reel it in, but the line didn't move. It was as if something heavy was anchored to the bottom of the ocean. I looked over at Sam, who was already watching me. "Got something?" he asked. "Yeah," I replied, still trying to reel it in, but it's not moving. It feels like it's stuck on something. "Maybe it's a rock," Sam said, but there was an edge of uncertainty in his voice. I continued pulling, but the line wouldn't budge. Whatever it was stuck. I gave one last pull, and suddenly there was a sharp, violent jerk on the rod. It nearly yanked it out of my hands. I managed to hold on, and after a few more moments of struggling, the line finally gave way, and the weight on the other end was gone. Sam's eyes widened. "What the hell was that?" "I don't know," I said, still trying to catch my breath. It felt like a big fish, but it didn't feel right. He stared at the water for a moment, his brow furrowed. Maybe it was a lost anchor or something. Old boat wrecks are all over this area. I didn't respond. I was still shaken, but I tried to shake it off. We decided to move to another spot, hoping the fishing would get better. We motored the boat a little further out, and I cast my line again. This time, the tension in the air seemed heavier, and the water was eerily still. We fished in silence for a while, neither of us saying anything. I was lost in my thoughts, still replaying that strange experience in my head, when Sam suddenly spoke. "You hear that?" I looked over at him. He was staring out into the darkening water, his face tight with concern. "What?" I asked. "Listen." I turned my head and strained to hear. At first, I thought it was just the sound of the boat's engine, but then I heard something else. It was a soft, low sound, almost like a hum, but it wasn't natural. It felt wrong. I couldn't place it. "Is that a boat?" Sam asked, his voice low. I shook my head. "No, I don't think so. It's too quiet." The humming sound grew louder, like it was moving closer. I could feel a knot tighten in my stomach. "Dude, what the hell is that?" Sam whispered. I didn't answer. My heart was racing, my senses on high alert. The water around the boat seemed unnaturally still, like everything in the world had stopped moving. I couldn't see anything in the distance, no lights, no shapes, just endless black water. The humming stopped suddenly, replaced by something else. A sound, a voice. "Help. Me." I froze. It was faint, almost drowned out by the waves, but it was unmistakable. It was a voice, and it was coming from beneath the water. Sam and I exchanged looks, both of us wide-eyed, but neither of us said anything. I don't know why we didn't react immediately, why we didn't just start the engine and get the hell out of there. Maybe we were both too stunned, too scared to move. "Help." The voice came again, this time louder, more distinct. It was a soft whisper, but it felt like it was right there, beside the boat. I turned toward the water, my eyes scanning the dark surface. There was nothing. No one. Just the ripples and the dark abyss. "Let's go," Sam finally said, his voice shaky. But before I could respond, the boat rocked violently, throwing us both off balance. We scrambled to steady ourselves, and I looked over the edge, my heart pounding in my chest. That's when I saw it, a hand. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but there was no mistaking it. A pale, waterlogged hand reaching up from the depths. It was thin, the fingers long and claw-like, the skin stretched tight over bone. The hand was moving slowly, dragging itself up toward the boat. "Shit!" Sam shouted, grabbing the motor and turning the key. The engine roared to life, and we shot forward, tearing through the water, leaving the hand and whatever else might have been lurking below behind. We didn't stop until we were back at the dock, the boat bumping roughly against the wooden pier. Neither of us said a word as we scrambled out of the boat and onto solid ground. Sam was shaking, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear. "Did you see that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. I nodded, unable to speak. We didn't stay long enough to pack up our gear. We didn't even bother to look back at the water. We just grabbed our things and left, the sound of the engine roaring as we sped back to the cabin. We didn't sleep much that night, both of us too terrified to close our eyes. We didn't even talk about it. We didn't have to. The fear was enough. The next morning, we packed up and left without saying a word. The thought of returning to that place, the thought of ever stepping foot on that water again was unbearable. I don't know what we saw that night. Maybe it was a trick of the mind, a hallucination brought on by fear or exhaustion. But I don't think so. There's something out there, beneath the water, something old and buried, waiting for someone to listen, waiting for someone to come too close. I never went fishing again after that. I don't think I ever will. Story the end.
Story number 14.
I had always been drawn to the quiet solitude of fishing, especially the kind of fishing that involved long hikes to remote, less traveled waters. As a teenager, I had spent nearly every weekend trekking into the nearby wilderness with my dad and later with my friends, learning how to fish and navigate the backwoods. After years of fishing all around the country, I'd grown accustomed to the peacefulness of the sport, like relishing the calm and serenity that came with the territory. But it was a trip in my early 30s that changed my perception of fishing forever. I had just finished a stint of working in the city and, craving some peace and quiet, decided to take a solo trip to a lake I'd heard about years ago, a lake tucked deep in the forests of northern Wisconsin. The lake, known as Devil's Eye, had an eerie reputation, but the locals didn't give it much weight. Still, there was something in the way they spoke of it. Stories of strange happenings, of people vanishing without a trace, that made it hard to shake the feeling that this trip might be something more than I bargained for. My friends dismissed the rumors as superstition, and I was determined to prove them wrong. I arrived at the small, isolated town of Forest Ridge late in the evening and grabbed some supplies from the local general store. The road that led to Devil's Eye wasn't well traveled, but after a few wrong turns, I managed to find it. The sun had just begun to set, and the eerie silhouette of the trees on either side of the narrow dirt road gave everything an unsettling feel. It felt like a scene from an old horror movie, but I brushed it off as my imagination running wild. After all, this was just a lake. How bad could it be? The last stretch of the road to the lake was a steep climb, the woods growing thicker around me. I parked my truck at the edge of the trail and grabbed my gear. The forest had a damp, earthy scent to it, and the only sounds were the rustle of leaves and the occasional bird call. It was as if the entire place was holding its breath. A quick glance at my watch told me that the sun was nearly gone, so I hastily made my way down the trail toward the water, determined to catch some fish before darkness set in. Devil's Eye Lake was as remote as they come. Surrounded by thick trees and steep cliffs, the lake was nearly impossible to see from the main road, making it a hidden gem for those who dared venture out. The water itself was dark, almost unnaturally so, and the surface reflected the towering trees and cloud-streaked sky like a mirror. A slight fog had already started to roll in, thickening the air as the temperature dropped. Despite the lake's beauty, something about it made me uneasy. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, but I told myself it was just the isolation getting to me. I set up my camp along the lake's edge, and as the sun finally dipped below the horizon, I cast my line out into the water. The gentle ripples of the lake created an almost hypnotic effect, and I soon found myself lost in the rhythm of the cast and reel. Time seemed to stretch out as the evening slipped into night. In the distance, I could hear the call of a lone owl and the occasional splash of fish jumping in the water. Still, there was something strange about the silence that hung in the air. It was almost too quiet. No sounds of small animals scurrying in the underbrush, no rustling of branches. The woods felt hollow, as if they were holding their breath, waiting. Around midnight, I decided to call it a night and headed back to my tent to get some sleep. I had just unzipped the flap when I heard it, a low, guttural sound. At first, I thought it was an animal, but it didn't quite sound like anything I'd ever heard before. It was too deep, too resonant, and it seemed to come from the water. A shiver ran down my spine, and I froze. For a moment, I considered ignoring it and going inside, but something told me that wasn't a good idea. I grabbed my flashlight and slowly made my way back toward the lake, scanning the dark woods around me. The flashlight's beam cut through the night, illuminating the trees and the thick fog that now clung to the shoreline. The low growl was growing louder, more distinct. It was coming from the water. I approached the edge of the lake cautiously, unsure of what I was about to find. I shined the light over the surface of the water, but everything seemed normal. The fog had thickened, and I could barely see a few feet into the lake. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I caught something moving. A large shape beneath the water, something that shifted with unnerving speed. My heart skipped a beat. The shape was dark, almost as if it was a shadow in the water, but it was massive, far bigger than any fish I had ever seen. I backed up slowly, unsure of what to do. My instincts were screaming at me to get out of there, but my curiosity got the best of me. I crept closer to the edge, staring into the murky water, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. Suddenly, I heard it again, the low growl, now louder and more insistent. It was coming from directly beneath me, as if something was lurking just below the surface, watching me. I took a step back and nearly tripped over a rock. As I caught myself, I noticed something odd. A faint trail of bubbles rising from the water. At first, I thought it was just the movement of a large fish, but then I saw something else. A pair of glowing eyes just below the waterline, staring directly at me. They were an unnatural shade of yellow, like nothing I had ever seen in nature. A cold sweat broke out on my skin, and I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. That's when the growl came again, much louder this time, and I could feel the vibration in my chest. I turned and sprinted back to my camp, not daring to look back. My breath was coming in ragged gasps as I fumbled with the tent's zipper, my hands shaking. I threw myself inside, my mind racing with fear and confusion. What the hell was that thing? I lay there in the dark, wide-eyed, listening to the strange sounds coming from outside. The growl had stopped, but the silence that followed was just as unsettling. Eventually, exhaustion overtook me, and I fell into a fitful sleep, only to be awoken by the sound of something moving around the perimeter of my camp. I shot up in bed, but by the time I grabbed my flashlight, the sound had disappeared. The next morning, I woke up with a heavy sense of dread hanging over me. The sun had risen, but the fog was still thick on the lake, and the air felt unusually cold for summer. I decided to leave. Whatever I had heard or seen the night before, I didn't want to stick around to find out more. I packed up my gear quickly, trying to shake off the feeling that I wasn't alone. As I walked back to my truck, I glanced over my shoulder one last time at the dark water of Devil's Eye Lake. Something in the distance caught my eye, just for a split second. The unmistakable shape of something large rising out of the water. I couldn't make out any details, but I didn't need to. I turned and hurried back to my truck, never looking back. On my way out, I passed a few locals in town. They gave me knowing looks, but no one said anything about the lake. In the weeks that followed, I asked around, but the locals seemed intent on avoiding any conversation about Devil's Eye. One old man, however, gave me a chilling warning. Some things are best left alone. Some things that live in those waters don't like company. I never returned to Devil's Eye Lake. It wasn't just the fear of what I had encountered that stopped me. It was the realization that whatever was in those waters wasn't something I could understand. And some places, no matter how tempting they may seem, are better left untouched. Story the end.
Story number 15.
I've always been a fan of fishing. It's the sort of activity that lets you disconnect from the world, sit in silence, and let the minutes and hours melt away. I've spent most of my life on lakes and rivers, never really thinking much of it. But that one trip to Black Hollow Lake changed everything I thought I knew about the piece of fishing. It all started when I heard about the lake from an old friend, Kyle. We used to fish together all the time back when we were younger, but we hadn't done much of that recently. Kyle had moved across the country a few years ago, but he was back in town visiting family, and he called me up one evening asking if I wanted to do a weekend fishing trip. Kyle had always been the more adventurous one between the two of us, but I was excited to get out of the city and spend some time away. He mentioned that he had found a remote spot, Black Hollow Lake, which was about 2 hours outside of town. I had never heard of it, but I trusted Kyle's judgment. He had always known the best places to fish. The lake was supposedly a hidden gem, hardly touched by other anglers. He claimed the fishing there was extraordinary, with rumors of some massive fish, and I was sold. A secluded, peaceful spot with plenty of fish. It sounded like the perfect way to spend the weekend. We made the plan for Friday afternoon, and I picked Kyle up at his place. He brought all the gear, and we packed it into my truck. The drive out to Black Hollow was a smooth one, with the countryside slowly giving way to dense forests and winding roads. As we got closer to the lake, the roads turned narrow, and the trees pressed in on both sides, the canopy thick above us. We were deep in the woods now. I remember looking around, taking in the quiet stillness of the area. It was the kind of place that felt untouched by time. There was no rush, no noise, just nature. When we finally arrived, the lake stretched out before us, wide, deep, and dark, framed by towering pine trees. The kind of lake that looked like it had secrets. We set up camp near a small clearing by the water's edge. There was no one else around, just the sound of the wind rustling through the trees and the faint ripple of the water as it lapped against the shore. We pitched a small tent, set up the gear, and started fishing right away. The sun was beginning to dip, casting an orange hue over the water. It felt like the perfect evening. We spent the next few hours casting our lines, chatting about old times, and laughing as we tried to outfish each other. Neither of us caught anything substantial, but it didn't matter. The evening was beautiful, and we were just enjoying being out there. It wasn't until late in the night that things started to feel strange. The night was eerily quiet. There was no breeze anymore, no movement in the trees, just silence. And then, for a moment, I swore I heard something, a faint noise from across the water. It wasn't an animal, not a bird or a fish. It was almost like a splash, but different, deeper somehow. The kind of noise that felt unnatural. I paused, listening. "Did you hear that?" I asked, looking over at Kyle, who was fiddling with the fishing gear. Kyle didn't look up. "Huh? Nah, I didn't hear anything." I shook my head, chalking it up to the dark or my imagination. We were deep in the woods after all. The sounds of nature could play tricks on you, so I decided to ignore it. But then, A few minutes later, I heard it again. This time, it was louder, more distinct, the unmistakable sound of something large splashing in the water. I turned quickly, eyes scanning the water, but I didn't see anything. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice more urgent this time. Kyle looked up, but he was dismissive. "Probably just a big fish. It's fine, man. Stop freaking yourself out." But I wasn't convinced. The lake had been so still earlier, so calm. It didn't feel like a regular splash. It felt intentional, like something was disturbing the water on purpose. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something else out there, something watching us from the depths. But Kyle laughed it off, and I figured I was just being paranoid. We stayed out by the water for another hour or so, the air growing colder, the dark wrapping around us. But despite my growing unease, we eventually decided to call it a night. We headed back to the tent, and Kyle immediately crashed out. I stayed up for a little while longer, staring out at the lake. The moon hung high in the sky, casting a pale light across the water. I couldn't stop glancing toward the spot where I had heard the splashes. That's when I saw it. A shadow, something large moving under the water. I couldn't make out the shape clearly, but it was big, too big for a fish. It glided silently just beneath the surface, disturbing the water in a way that felt wrong. It wasn't just a fish. It moved too smoothly, almost like it was circling, waiting. My heart began to race, and I quickly ducked back into the tent, my breath short. I lay there in the dark, staring at the tent's walls, trying to convince myself it was nothing. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I managed to fall asleep eventually, but it wasn't a restful sleep. The strange unease gnawed at me, and I kept waking up every few hours, checking the lake outside. By morning, I was exhausted, but I didn't say anything to Kyle. He was already packing up the gear, eager to get out on the water again. As the sun rose, the mist over the lake started to lift, and we made our way back to the shore, ready for a day of fishing. The air was cool, and the lake was perfectly still. No ripples, no sounds. But the feeling from the night before lingered. We spent most of the morning casting our lines in silence. Kyle caught a decent-sized bass, and I was still trying to hook something. Then, around midday, the oddest thing happened. Kyle suddenly froze, rod in hand, staring out at the water with wide eyes. "Dude, what the hell is that?" he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I turned to see what he was pointing at. My stomach dropped. There in the distance, the water was rippling violently, but not in a way that made sense. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't from a fish. It looked almost like something large was moving beneath the surface, thrashing and struggling, but there was no clear shape, no clear indication of what it was. "That's not a fish," Kyle said, his voice trembling. I agreed. It didn't look natural. It was too big, and it moved too deliberately. My mind raced, trying to think of an explanation, but nothing came to mind. The water was still for a moment, and then the ripples ceased. The lake returned to its unnatural calm. We both stared at the spot for a long time, unsure of what to do. It was then that we heard something we hadn't heard before, a low, guttural growl. It came from somewhere far beyond us, but it was unmistakable. Not an animal, not a bear or a wolf, something deeper, something primal. Without a word, we both started reeling in our lines. I couldn't shake the sense that something was wrong, that whatever was in that lake didn't want us there. It was as if we were intruding on its territory. We didn't even pack up our gear. We jumped into the boat, fired up the engine, and made a beeline for the shore. As we approached the bank, I looked over my shoulder one last time. That's when I saw it again. Something massive just beneath the water's surface following us, its shadow stretching far below the waterline. We didn't stop to ask questions. We didn't look back. We packed up and drove back to town, never speaking of the events that unfolded at Black Hollow Lake. To this day, I don't know what we saw out there. Some say there are rumors of strange creatures in lakes and deep waters, things that we aren't meant to understand. Maybe it was a giant fish. Maybe it was something else. I don't know, and I don't think I ever want to find out. All I know is that I haven't been fishing since. Story the end.